Shut August 31st, 1997, Akron, Ohio. 17-year-old Rachel Monroe ended her late shift at Pine Street Pizza and made a final call from a flickering payphone booth. "I'll be home soon." Hours later, her battered backpack, covered in band stickers, was discovered in a dumpster near the bus stop. But Rachel herself had vanished into the night. The community of Akron was shaken. Candlelight vigils lit the church steps. Her face stared back from hundreds of missing person flyers, and yet no answers came. For years, her empty chair at the family table stood as a painful reminder of a life cut short. Then, 14 years later, a forgotten set of skeletal remains, mislabeled and buried as unidentified, was unearthed. DNA tests revealed a shocking truth that reopened the case and tore through the town's fragile peace. If it wasn't her stepfather, and it wasn't her ex-boyfriend, then who drove Rachel into the night and never brought her home? Some wounds can only be healed by the truth. Subscribe to our channel, follow, and turn on the notification bell, because in every cold case, one clue can change everything. Late summer draped itself lazily across Akron, Ohio, that night in 1997, the kind of thick, humid darkness that seemed to press against your skin, that made the streetlights blur with halos. It was the last Friday of August, just days before the first chilly winds of September would sweep through the tired neighborhoods, rustling the overgrown lawns and cracked sidewalks of a city still licking its wounds from better days. Most people had already shut their blinds, flicked off their porch lights, and retreated into the safe glow of their TV sets. But not everyone. 17-year-old Rachel Monroe pressed through the heavy back door of Pine Street Pizza, the smell of mozzarella and tomato sauce still clinging to her faded work shirt. She glanced at the neon clock above the register, counting down the last seconds of her late shift. Rachel had always been the last to leave. She liked the quiet, the brief hush after the kitchen boys had banged out the door and the radio was finally silent. In her hands, she clutched a battered backpack, the fabric worn thin at the corners, the zipper ringed with little metal charms, and a patch of the Smashing Pumpkins stitched on one side. Her sketchbook peeked from inside, its cover plastered with band stickers, doodles, and bold, angry lines that hinted at someone who wanted to leave her mark on the world. She didn't waste time saying goodnight to the boss. She'd learned not to linger. It was only a half-mile to the train station, but she moved fast, boots thumping over gum-stained concrete, heart jumping a little every time a car cruised past too slowly. Most of the shops were shuttered and dark, except for the glowing rectangle of a payphone booth set back from the curb beneath a flickering streetlight. She stepped inside, letting the thin glass door close behind her, and dug out a few quarters. Rachel's fingers trembled as she dialed the only number she knew by heart. Her foster mother, waiting for her on the other end. "I'll be home soon," she said, her voice flat but determined, covering the slight edge of exhaustion that crept in after long nights. The call lasted less than a minute. There was no laughter, no soft goodbyes, just a promise, a routine check-in, the kind that happens 1,000 times in 1,000 towns, until it doesn't. She hung up. Outside, the parking lot was empty, except for a bus idling at the corner and a couple of figures silhouetted in the hazy yellow spill of the convenience store across the street. Rachel hesitated for a moment, the phone still warm in her hand. Something felt off. She couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching, a subtle prickling at the back of her neck, but she pushed it down, like she always did. Rachel was used to being tough, to handling her own fears. She left the booth, adjusted her backpack, and strode towards the bus stop, her boots crunching through the stray gravel and broken glass. A train roared past on the tracks behind her, rattling the ground beneath her feet. If anyone had been watching from a second-story window, they would have seen just another teenage girl crossing the lot, a ghost in jeans and a work shirt, hair pulled into a messy ponytail, moving with that peculiar blend of bravado and vulnerability unique to 17. She didn't know that these small, mundane details, the scuffed boots, the way her head turned left and right before crossing the road, the sag of her backpack, would soon be pored over by detectives and worried neighbors, etched into flyers and news reports as the last clues to her existence. Minutes after the call, Rachel Monroe disappeared into the night. The darkness closed around her, swallowing her up like a secret. She never came home. At first, nobody panicked. Her foster mother paced the living room, convinced that Rachel had simply missed the bus or stopped to hang out with friends. The clock ticked forward, the hands moving in agonizing slow motion. Midnight came and went. The TV played on, low and flickering, as if its glow might call Rachel back. It wasn't until the sun rose over Akron, splitting the horizon with streaks of pale orange and blue, that the nightmare began to take shape. Rachel's bed was still made, her sketchbook missing, her room unchanged. The house felt colder, emptier. A sick feeling of dread seeped in, silent and unshakable. The next day, her foster mother called the police, her voice trembling. She recited the story so many times her words started to sound rehearsed. She left work. She called me. She said she'd be home soon. No one could say when or how that routine promise shattered. For the people of Akron, Rachel's face soon became impossible to ignore. Flyers went up at the train station, on pizza shop windows, at every corner store. The same image, her half-smile, defiant eyes, a shock of hair falling across her cheek, stared back from 1,000 lampposts. Rumors buzzed through high school hallways and break rooms. Some whispered she'd run away with a boy. Others wondered if she'd finally snapped, if she'd simply had enough and left everything behind. But those closest to her, the ones who knew her laughter, her stubbornness, her fragile hope for something better, knew something else had happened. Beneath the veneer of a sleepy, post-industrial town, old secrets began to stir. A community that once prided itself on knowing all its neighbors suddenly realized how little it knew. Rachel Monroe had vanished, and no one, not her family, not her friends, not even the police, could explain why. But the truth was still out there, buried in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And one day, years later, a single piece of forgotten evidence would drag it back into the light, forcing everyone to confront the question that haunted every sleepless night. Who stole Rachel's future? Rachel Monroe had never really belonged anywhere, not in the house on Mayfield Avenue with its peeling shutters and sunburned lawn, not in the high school halls where cliques drifted like territorial clouds, and certainly not in the tidy world her foster mother tried so hard to keep together. But she was used to that, used to being a bit of an outsider, the observer on the fringe. If you watched her closely enough, you'd notice how she filled in the empty spaces, her sketchbook always open, pencil moving restlessly, eyes hungry for details others missed. Drawing was her oxygen, her way of mapping a world that never quite fit. She was a senior that year, perched on the edge of adulthood with all its promises and threats. Guidance counselors talked about scholarships and deadlines, but Rachel tuned them out. She dreamed of leaving Akron behind, enrolling in an art school where she could disappear into a crowd of fellow weirdos. Her drawings sprawled across pages, fantastical cityscapes, album covers inspired by her favorite rock bands, portraits of friends frozen in moments of unguarded laughter. She saw beauty in unlikely places, a rusted fence overrun by ivy, a broken sign glowing in the blue dusk, the way rain painted city lights onto the sidewalk. Rachel wasn't the kind of girl who played by the rules. She wore thrift store jeans ripped at the knees, leather bracelets that jingled when she sketched, and combat boots she'd found in a garage sale for $3. She dyed streaks of her hair electric blue every few months, a silent rebellion against the blandness that threatened to swallow her whole. Most days after school, you could find her at the park with a couple of friends. Other misfits and dreamers, sprawled on the grass or clustered on swings, swapping stories and doodling on each other's sneakers with Sharpies. But for all her rebellion, Rachel cared deeply, fiercely about the people in her life. She remembered every birthday, every inside joke. She slipped hand-drawn notes into her friends' lockers, little reminders that someone was thinking of them. Beneath her tough, sarcastic exterior, there was a tenderness she tried to hide, a hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Home was complicated. Rachel lived with her foster mother, Evelyn, and Evelyn's husband, Dan. Evelyn had tried her best to make a home for Rachel since she arrived 2 years earlier. A bedroom filled with plants and old posters, dinners around a wobbly table, an earnest attempt at mother-daughter normalcy. But there was a distance between them, a kind of careful politeness, as if both were afraid to break something fragile. Dan, her foster stepfather, was an imposing figure, quiet, strict, with a habit of watching Rachel from the corner of his eye. He was a man of few words, but his presence filled the house, leaving Rachel to tiptoe around invisible boundaries. Akron itself was a town in slow decline, its glory days as the rubber capital of the world, now just faded photographs in dusty library archives. Old factories lined the Cuyahoga River, their windows boarded and broken, hulks of steel and concrete now claimed by weeds and graffiti. The smell of hot rubber and machine oil that once hung over everything had faded, replaced by the sour tang of nostalgia and empty storefronts. Still, the people of Akron clung to their routines. Sunday church, high school football games under flickering stadium lights, block parties where the same songs played year after year. In this place, everyone seemed to know each other, or at least claimed to. The same families had lived on the same streets for decades, their secrets interwoven like roots beneath the cracked pavement. Rachel sometimes wondered how much the neighbors really saw, or if they only saw what they wanted to see. There were smiles at the grocery store, nods at the mailbox, but whispers traveled faster than truth. Sometimes, late at night, Rachel felt the weight of those whispers pressing against her bedroom walls. Yet Akron had its own strange beauty. The city's decay gave it character, a sense of melancholy resilience. The old train station where Rachel sometimes sketched had once been bustling with life, but now it stood mostly empty, except for the distant rumble of freight trains and the occasional lost traveler. The public park, with its cracked basketball courts and spray-painted benches, became a sanctuary for Rachel and her friends. In the summer, the air buzzed with cicadas and the scent of cut grass. In the winter, fresh snow hid the city's scars, making everything look clean and new for a little while. For Rachel, the boundaries between hope and disappointment, freedom and confinement, were always blurred. Her foster mother tried to enforce curfews and chores, but Rachel pushed back, sneaking out to concerts in neighboring towns, lying about her whereabouts just to taste the thrill of independence. There were arguments, some loud, some simmering under the surface, but also moments of rare understanding. A shared joke over burnt toast, a ride to the art store, a quiet hug after a bad day. Rachel wanted more from life, but she also wanted to believe she could find it here, if only for a little while. As the last days of August bled into September, there was a restlessness in the air, a sense that everything was about to change. Rachel sketched more furiously than ever, filling page after page with fragments of dreams, faces that watched her from the margins, places she longed to go. At night, she lay awake listening to the trains, her mind racing with plans and fears. No one, not her friends, not her family, not Rachel herself, could know just how fragile those dreams really were. In a town full of secrets, with everyone watching and yet no one truly seeing, Rachel Monroe lived her final days surrounded by hope and heartache, drawing her world one careful line at a time. The night of August 31st in Akron pressed down with a stillness that was almost suffocating, the kind that seems to warn you that something is about to change. At Pine Street Pizza, the fluorescent lights buzzed, signaling the end of another shift. Rachel clocked out with the same distracted, determined energy she brought to everything. She paused only long enough to slip her sketchbook into her backpack and wipe the pizza flour from her hands before she pushed out into the cooling air. Her mind was already drifting, half on a half-finished drawing, half on the coming school year, and half on the endless feeling that something else waited for her beyond the city limits. Her co-worker Maria saw her step off the curb, boots scuffing the faded paint of the crosswalk. Maria would later recall how Rachel seemed in a hurry, glancing over her shoulder more than once as if she expected someone to be there, shadowing her steps. It was a small detail, but in the aftermath, those small details took on new weight. Every glance, every nervous movement, every unexplained pause. At the corner bus stop, the sodium streetlights gave everything an orange glow. The battered city bus hissed to a stop, its doors folding open with a tired creak. Rachel climbed aboard, head down, the driver giving her a nod. She took a seat near the middle, dropping her backpack to the floor and hugging her sketchbook to her chest. There were a few other passengers, an older woman with grocery bags, a man in a Cleveland Browns jacket, a pair of teenagers whispering and laughing. Rachel watched the city slide by outside the window. Boarded-up shops, the distant lights of the train yard, the shadowed shapes of old houses set back from the street. As the bus wound through Akron's sleepy neighborhoods, Rachel disappeared into her thoughts. She pulled her knees up and rested her chin on them, absently tracing shapes on the foggy glass with her finger. She wasn't afraid, not really, but the world always felt slightly unpredictable, like the ground beneath her feet could shift at any moment. The routine of riding the bus was comforting, familiar, a slice of independence she clung to. When the bus finally rumbled to a stop near her block, Rachel stood, slinging her backpack over one shoulder and nodding to the driver. She stepped off into the humid night. The street was silent except for the distant wail of a train horn and the quiet hum of insects. Rachel headed down the sidewalk, cutting through the shadows cast by overgrown hedges and flickering porch lights. But what happened next is the question that haunted Akron for years. By the following morning, her backpack, so carefully guarded, covered in band stickers and doodles, was found tossed in a dumpster behind the bus stop. The contents were scattered. Her sketchbook, half crushed beneath a pizza receipt, a few pens. the charm from her zipper. It was as if someone had tried to erase her presence, to make her disappear not just from the world, but from memory itself. Rachel, however, was gone. No one had seen her after she stepped off the bus. The old woman with the groceries remembered her. The man in the jacket thought he might have seen her get off, but no one noticed what happened between the time she vanished into the night and the moment the world realized she was missing. The next hours blurred together for those who cared for Rachel. Her foster mother called the police in a panic when Rachel didn't come home, her voice cracking with every detail she recounted. Officers arrived, asking quiet questions, poking through Rachel's room, looking for any clue. But there was nothing. Her bed was made, her closet neat, the walls still covered in hand-drawn posters and dreams she'd never get to finish. Flyers went up almost immediately, but the air around town felt different now, more charged, more fearful. Parents clung to their children a little tighter, and kids who used to wander the streets after dark started coming home earlier. The police interviewed friends and neighbors. They searched the park where Rachel liked to sketch, the alleys behind the convenience store, the shadowy spaces under the old train bridge. But the trail was already cold. At school, Rachel's empty seat became a symbol of something none of her friends wanted to face. Her art teacher kept the last project Rachel had turned in, a collage of magazine cutouts and rough sketches, tacked to the bulletin board, a silent tribute. Some of her friends made bracelets and wore them in solidarity, refusing to let her memory slip away. But as the days passed, hope started to waver, replaced by a chilling numbness. News crews came and went, their cameras briefly lighting up the Monroe home before moving on to other stories. Theories buzzed through town like summer cicadas. Some whispered that Rachel had run away, that maybe life in Akron had finally squeezed the hope out of her. Others, more quietly, wondered if something darker had happened, if someone she trusted had betrayed her, or if a stranger had chosen her at random. But in the end, there was nothing. No ransom note, no sightings, no dramatic confession, just an ordinary teenage girl gone without a word, leaving behind a city that could not quite remember how to feel safe. Years later, the memory of that night would still cling to the city like a bruise, an unanswered question pressed into every shadow, every silent street, every empty bus stop. Rachel Monroe was gone, and Akron would never be the same. The morning Rachel Monroe was officially declared missing, a heavy sorrow crept through the house on Mayfield Avenue and spilled into the streets of Akron, carrying with it the raw ache of uncertainty. Inside her bedroom, sunlight poked through faded curtains, illuminating the stacks of sketchbooks, piles of thrift store clothes, and the small, hopeful clutter of a 17-year-old girl who should have been there to greet the new day. But Rachel was gone, and her absence was already beginning to hollow out the lives of those who loved her. Evelyn Monroe, Rachel's foster mother, sat at the edge of Rachel's neatly made bed, her hands shaking as she stared at the empty space where her daughter's backpack should have been. There were no comforting explanations left, just the cold, spreading dread that something terrible had happened. Evelyn clutched a framed photograph of Rachel, her thumb running over the image as if she could summon her daughter back by sheer force of will. In the kitchen, Dan paced in short, tense lines, muttering to himself and avoiding Evelyn's tearful gaze. He flinched at every phone call, every knock on the door. His nerves wound tight as wire. The news spread quickly, rippling through the neighborhood and sending shockwaves far beyond. By afternoon, Rachel's friends and teachers were papering telephone poles, bus stops, and shop windows with homemade flyers. Her face, hopeful, challenging, a wry half-smile on her lips, became impossible to avoid. The flyer's words, "Missing, last seen August 31st, please help," echoed through the city like a plea no one knew how to answer. A silent panic gripped the community. At first, the neighbors gathered at the Monroe house with casseroles, hugs, and murmured reassurances. But as hours turned into days, the tone changed. Measured comfort twisted into anxious speculation. Rachel's name came up at backyard barbecues, after Sunday services, in whispered conversations between teachers in the faculty lounge. Akron, once a place where everyone claimed to know each other, suddenly felt full of strangers. The boundaries between public concern and private suspicion blurred. The local church opened its doors, hosting candlelight vigils that filled the sanctuary with a golden, trembling glow. People prayed in tight circles, clutching each other's hands and sending hopes skyward, their faith tested by the darkness closing in. Outside, vigil candles flickered on the church steps, fragile flames trying to hold back the uncertainty. Each night, more people joined. Students clutching backpacks, parents holding onto their kids, old friends and new faces alike. The gathering was part ritual, part desperate attempt to keep hope alive. Yet underneath the outpouring of support, another current ran colder and more dangerous. Rumors twisted their way through the town, each new version of the story more dramatic than the last. Some said Rachel had run off with her ex-boyfriend, a troubled boy with a reputation for stirring up trouble. Others whispered about late-night arguments overheard from the Monroe house, or about unfamiliar cars seen cruising the neighborhood in the weeks before Rachel vanished. Theories multiplied, each one pointing fingers in new directions. The Monroe family felt these whispers closing in, stifling and inescapable. Evelyn tried to ignore them, focusing instead on organizing searches, making calls, holding on to whatever control she had left. But the stress wore her thin. She stopped eating, her face growing gaunt and shadowed. Each night, she kept Rachel's bedroom door open, refusing to change anything inside, convinced that somehow her daughter would walk through the doorway as if nothing had happened. Dan's reaction was different, quieter, but somehow more troubling. He became withdrawn, spending long hours sitting on the porch or disappearing on long drives. When friends or police officers questioned him, he grew defensive, his voice flat and his answers curt. People noticed. In a town as small as Akron, suspicion didn't need facts to take root. It only needed the space left by silence. Rachel's friends tried to keep the hope alive, but even among them, the fear grew. Some gathered in the park, sitting in a loose circle on the grass, swapping memories of Rachel and making silent promises to never forget. Others became obsessed with the mystery, poring over every detail, scrutinizing every rumor as if the right question might break the case open. At school, her absence was a raw wound, her locker decorated with notes, flowers, and sketches, each one a silent message to a girl who might never see them. For a while, the town tried to carry on. The bus routes stayed the same. The pizza shop reopened. The church bells chimed on Sundays. But beneath the daily routine, nothing felt normal. Doors were locked earlier, children were watched more closely, and everyone looked over their shoulder a little more often. Fear was contagious, and soon Akron wore it like a second skin. As the days dragged on, hope and dread battled in every heart. Each candlelight vigil grew a little quieter. The flyers faded, their edges curling in the summer heat, but they remained, stubborn reminders that one of their own was still missing. For some, hope was a candle that could never be snuffed out. For others, It was a cruel trick of the light, destined to flicker and die. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of all their prayers and searching eyes, the truth about Rachel Monroe's disappearance lay buried, waiting to be unearthed, waiting to shatter what little piece Akron still clung to. The search for Rachel Monroe quickly evolved from frantic hope to a grim investigation. Within hours, Akron's small police department had set up a makeshift command center at the station, pinning maps and timetables to corkboards, piecing together the last known moments of Rachel's life. The phone in the Monroe house rang day and night, the voices on the other end alternating between sympathy and suspicion, every conversation replayed in Evelyn's mind, like a loop she couldn't escape. Police officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, collecting stories that rarely matched. Some neighbors remembered seeing Rachel at the bus stop. Others insisted she'd taken a shortcut home. The pizza shop manager swore she'd left alone. A night shift janitor at the train station claimed he'd seen a girl with blue hair speaking to someone in a dark car. Each story bent and shifted in the retelling, truth mixing with speculation until no one was certain of anything. Detectives focused first on Rachel's home life. The uneasy silence between Evelyn and Dan, the way the air tensed whenever an officer entered their living room, did not go unnoticed. In their statements, Rachel's foster mother described a girl headstrong but loving, prone to stubborn silences after arguments, especially with Dan. Evelyn clung to the idea that Rachel would never have simply run away without a word. She insisted her daughter always came home, even after the most heated fights. But under the questions, Dan grew evasive. When asked about his relationship with Rachel, he shifted in his seat, voice low and arms crossed, giving the sort of answers that left more questions than they resolved. The rumor mill fed on these details. Some in Akron were quick to recall an argument they'd overheard just days before Rachel vanished, a fight that ended with slamming doors and Rachel storming out into the night. Whispers grew, painting Dan as a harsh man, quick-tempered, hard to reach. Others rushed to defend him, describing him as strict but fair, a man trying to hold a fragile household together. But suspicion, once sown, was impossible to uproot. The investigation widened. Police traced Rachel's final movements, building a timeline from witness statements and security camera footage. The last clear image, a grainy still from a gas station camera, showed her boarding the bus with her backpack slung over her shoulder, eyes fixed on the sidewalk. Officers retraced the bus route, interviewing every passenger they could identify, but the leads fizzled quickly. The driver remembered Rachel, but not anyone who seemed out of place. The old woman with the groceries insisted Rachel got off alone, blending into the humid darkness. The trail grew cold before it ever really warmed. Attention shifted to Rachel's ex-boyfriend, a troubled local boy with a reputation for breaking rules. His name was scrawled in the margins of Rachel's notebooks, tangled in sketches and angry lyrics. He had been seen lurking around the school in the days before she disappeared, sometimes watching Rachel from a distance. Teachers remembered a tense confrontation near the art room, a heated exchange. Rachel turning away with clenched fists. It was enough to draw the police's full attention. They questioned him for hours, prodding at inconsistencies in his story. He denied everything. No, he hadn't seen Rachel that night. No, he hadn't called her, followed her, or waited at her bus stop. But he couldn't explain why he'd been seen outside her school or why friends reported he'd seemed agitated after Rachel vanished. They searched his room, combed through his messages and belongings, hoping for a missed clue or careless confession. But the evidence wasn't there. All they found were faded photos and scribbled song lyrics, pieces of a broken romance, but nothing that would bring Rachel home. As the days wore on, the investigation lost momentum. Each theory collapsed under scrutiny, every alibi eventually confirmed. The neighbors, once united in fear, began to pull away from one another. Eyes narrowed over fences, conversations turning wary. At the Monroe home, Dan's nerves grew raw. He kept his distance from the reporters and community volunteers who gathered each day, his anger simmering at the edge of every interaction. Evelyn moved like a ghost through her own house, clinging to hope, refusing to believe the worst, but haunted by the possibility that someone close had betrayed them all. The police, under mounting public pressure, struggled to keep the case alive. They released statements to the local news, urging anyone with information to come forward. But the tips that arrived were vague and unreliable. A car seen speeding away from the bus stop, a stranger walking the alleys at midnight, a muffled scream, maybe imagined, maybe not. Each detail added another thread to a web that never quite connected. And so, as summer faded into autumn, Rachel's disappearance became the central mystery of Akron, a wound that would not heal, a shadow that stretched across every porch light and school hallway. The rumors persisted, the theories multiplied, and beneath it all, the sense of unease only deepened. Rachel Monroe had vanished, and with every day that passed, it seemed less likely that the truth would ever be found. As autumn descended over Akron, life's routines began to reassert themselves, as if the city itself was trying to forget the wound that refused to heal. September brought new classes and football games, the hum of school buses, and the first hints of frost curling across the empty playgrounds. For the Monroe household, though, the passage of time brought only emptiness, a hollow repetition that marked each day Rachel was gone. In the weeks after the investigation stalled, the house on Mayfield Avenue took on the air of a shrine. Rachel's bedroom remained untouched, her sketchbook still stacked on the nightstand, the jacket she wore on cold nights slung over the back of her desk chair, the faint smell of her citrus shampoo lingering like a memory. Evelyn Monroe refused to move anything, as if disrupting the space would erase the last traces of her daughter. Every evening, Evelyn set the table for 3, even though only 2 plates were used. Rachel's chair stayed empty, a silent accusation, a stubborn ritual that no one dared question. The world outside kept spinning. News vans packed up and left. The stories about Rachel Monroe slipped down the ranks of the evening broadcast, replaced by new tragedies, new faces. Flyers yellowed and peeled from telephone poles, their curled corners flapping in the wind until they were finally swept away with the rest of the city's litter. At the high school, teachers stopped mentioning Rachel's name, unwilling to dwell on pain that could not be solved with tests or parent-teacher meetings. Her friends tried to keep her memory alive, at first gathering after school in the park to swap stories, then just a few holding on, until even those circles drifted apart. The pain of not knowing worked like slow poison. For Evelyn, every day without answers chipped away at hope. She called the police station regularly, her voice becoming smaller each time, pleading for news, for updates, for anything. She grew accustomed to the distant sympathy in the detective's tone, the long pauses as he searched for words that wouldn't hurt too much. Eventually, the calls came less often. The police had done all they could, the detective explained gently. Without new leads, Rachel's file would be placed in the archives, just another cold case among hundreds across Ohio. The Monroe home became quieter, the air thick with things unspoken. Dan buried himself in work, staying late at the factory or volunteering for extra shifts. When he was home, he hovered at the edge of every room, reluctant to break the fragile quiet Evelyn clung to. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear the front door open and close softly, Dan slipping out for a drive or a cigarette, anything to escape the suffocating stillness. Thanksgiving passed, then Christmas, the rituals feeling more hollow each year. Evelyn still hung Rachel's stocking, still bought a small gift, wrapped it carefully, and placed it under the tree. She told herself it was a promise, that Rachel would come home, that the world hadn't closed its doors for good. But as the years ticked by, those hopes felt increasingly like self-deceptions. The candles from the church vigils were long since melted away. Even the neighbors who once brought casseroles and offers to help grew uncomfortable, their pity replaced by a wary awkwardness, as if Rachel's disappearance were a contagious sadness. For the city, Rachel's absence slowly became just another part of the landscape, a wound covered by layers of time and distraction. There were always new headlines, new scandals, and tragedies to fill the space on the evening news. At the police department, Rachel's file, once thick with reports and witness statements, was boxed and shelved, the label faded, her face reduced to a single black and white photograph clipped to the front. Every so often, a rookie detective would stumble across her case, flipping through the pages with detached curiosity, but without new evidence, there was nothing left to do. Evelyn's routines became rituals of remembrance. On Rachel's birthday, she left wildflowers at the park bench where her daughter used to sit and draw. She visited the bus stop where Rachel was last seen, standing quietly as traffic rolled by, willing herself to remember every detail: the sound of trains in the distance, the cool snap of autumn air, the distant voices of strangers. These pilgrimages were her way of keeping Rachel alive, of refusing to let the world forget. Time passed, and with it, the city's memory faded. A new generation of students filled the high school hallways, their lives untouched by Rachel's story. New families moved into the neighborhood, repainting houses, planting gardens over ground that once felt sacred. Even the rumors eventually faded, replaced by other scandals, other mysteries. The only constant was the empty chair at the Monroe table, a symbol of loss that no one could erase. For Evelyn, hope became a fragile thing, flickering in the dark corners of her heart. There were nights when she believed Rachel might still walk through the door, older, changed, but alive. More often, though, there were only dreams. Rachel's voice calling from another room, her laughter echoing down empty hallways, fading as the sun rose. And in the dark corners of Akron, as the years blurred together and the world moved on, the story of Rachel Monroe slipped quietly from memory, a candle of hope finally guttering out, lost to the shadows of forgetting. 14 years passed in Akron, the mystery of Rachel Monroe woven so tightly into the town's fabric that most people had stopped picking at the threads. New families had moved onto Mayfield Avenue. The pizza shop was under new ownership, the payphone replaced by a row of battered newspaper boxes. Only the oldest neighbors still remembered the night Rachel disappeared and the fear that once blanketed their community. But beneath the dust of the years, her case had never truly disappeared. It had only gone dormant, waiting for the right moment and the right person to bring it back to life. In the spring of 2012, Allison Price, a 22-year-old anthropology student at a small Ohio university, found herself immersed in a project that would change everything. She'd always been drawn to stories left unfinished, to names that had slipped through the cracks. When her professor assigned the class to study cold cases of unidentified remains from across the state, Allison spent hours scrolling through online archives, reading pages filled with statistics and sorrow. One case in particular caught her attention. A set of female skeletal remains discovered in 1998 in Cuyahoga Valley National Park, logged only as Jane Doe. The file was frustratingly thin. A list of bones, a mention of a bullet wound, and a notation that the remains had been buried in a pauper's grave after clerical errors prevented their identification. Allison dug deeper, chasing the cold trails through police records and online databases. She noticed that the estimated age, the timing of the discovery, and the location all seemed eerily close to the details she remembered from a true crime podcast about Rachel Monroe's disappearance. The more she read, the more she wondered if these two stories, separated by years and by bureaucracy, might actually belong together. She posted her findings on a message board dedicated to missing persons, laying out the parallels between Rachel and the unidentified remains, the missing teenage girl, the year she vanished, the rough location in the national park, even a brief witness report about a gray sedan seen near the park entrance that same week. The thread caught fire, first among amateur sleuths and cold case volunteers, then with journalists and local bloggers. Rachel's story was pulled back into the public eye, this time with a new urgency. The pressure built, spilling into the offices of law enforcement and the corner desks of city officials who'd long since closed her file. Finally, under public scrutiny and the collective persistence of people who refused to let Rachel be forgotten, the county coroner ordered the exhumation of the unidentified remains. Television trucks and news crews gathered at the edge of the cemetery as the grave was opened, cameras capturing the moment in somber silence. For the Monroe family, Evelyn, now older and frailer, her hair gone gray and her eyes clouded with memories, the weight was excruciating. She barely slept, pacing the living room at night, clutching the last photograph she had of Rachel, her hands trembling every time the phone rang. DNA testing took weeks. The process was clinical, dispassionate. The samples sent off to a distant lab while a community held its breath. Even the police, many of whom were too young to remember the original case, found themselves swept up in the wave of renewed interest. Rachel's high school friends, scattered now across the country, traded texts and phone calls, reliving the confusion and fear of their teenage years. The evidence was irrefutable. The remains were Rachel's. The girl who had haunted Akron's memory, whose absence was still marked at her family table, had finally been found, though the truth offered little comfort. The forensic report revealed the cause of death: a single gunshot wound to the head. There were no other marks of violence, no evidence of a prolonged struggle, only the brutal finality of a crime that had taken less than a minute to commit. The news swept through the town like a second storm, reigniting old grief and old guilt. For Evelyn, the revelation was a strange mix of relief and devastation. She spent days in silence, wandering through the house, unable to let go of the rituals she'd built around Rachel's absence. The community responded with an outpouring of support. Candlelight vigils rekindled in the church, old friends appearing at the door with flowers and casseroles. But the sense of closure was incomplete. Too many questions remained. Who had killed Rachel? Why had her case gone cold? And most chillingly, who had erased the links between Rachel and the Jane Doe buried in the park? Among the evidence files, an old witness report surfaced, nearly forgotten in the chaos of the initial investigation. It described Rachel getting into a gray sedan driven by a familiar face from the neighborhood. A report that had, for reasons never fully explained, vanished from official records. This missing detail threw the case wide open again, casting suspicion in new directions and hinting at secrets still waiting to be uncovered. For the first time in years, hope and dread returned to Akron in equal measure. The truth was close now, almost within reach. All that remained was to find the final piece, the one person who had carried the truth in silence all these years, hiding in plain sight among the people who thought they knew everyone. News of the DNA match spread through Akron like wildfire, first as a whisper in online forums, then a headline in the morning paper, and finally as an unignorable reality, heavy as a storm cloud, for every person who'd once felt the shadow of Rachel Monroe's disappearance. The town paused, as if time itself stuttered, caught between the relief of knowing and the shock of what that knowledge meant. At the Monroe house, grief surfaced in new forms. Evelyn spent hours at the kitchen table, the phone pressed to her ear, answering calls from detectives, journalists, long-lost friends, each conversation dredging up the ache of the past and the cold clarity of the present. Rachel was gone, truly gone. Her story no longer just absence, but tragedy. Evelyn wept quietly over old photo albums, fingers tracing her daughter's face in fading snapshots, remembering the smell of her shampoo, the laughter that used to fill their home. Dan was a shadow, moving through rooms with a haunted look, his silence now deeper than ever. The reopening of the case was both a mercy and a wound. Police dusted off Rachel's old file, cross-referencing every note and statement, every half-forgotten tip. The lead detective, a woman too young to have worked the original case, tacked new printouts to the board. Timelines, bus routes, the chilling forensic report from the national park. Rachel's friends, now adults scattered across the state, found themselves revisiting old wounds, reliving the uncertainty that had colored their teenage years. For many, the years had brought distance and resignation. Now, the wound was raw again. As investigators worked backward from the discovery of Rachel's remains, the list of suspects shifted, then shrank. Dan's alibi, which had once seemed thin and unsatisfying, was finally verified. A grainy security tape from the factory where he worked, time-stamped for the night Rachel vanished. He had been at work, working overtime with a supervisor and 3 other men, all their stories matching, all the times lining up. The ex-boyfriend, once the subject of so much gossip and suspicion, was also cleared. Phone records, receipts, and the testimony of his extended family placed him across town at a cousin's birthday party, nowhere near the national park or the neighborhood where Rachel disappeared. One by one, the easy answers dissolved. What remained was uncertainty, sharpened now by the forensic reality. A gunshot, sudden and cold. No one knew who could have driven Rachel out to the park, or why she would have gotten into their car. But the detail from the witness report, unearthed after years in storage, offered a chilling clue. Rachel was seen getting into a gray sedan, driven by someone familiar, not a stranger, not an outsider, but someone from the fabric of her own community. This revelation sent new tremors through Akron. Who had been overlooked in the original investigation? Whose name had never come up? Simply because they were too ordinary, too much a part of everyday life. The police combed through old witness lists, teachers, neighbors, the faces that appeared in the background of Rachel's life. Suspicion settled uneasily over the town. The people who'd spent years comforting themselves with the idea of a faceless stranger began to wonder, had the truth always been closer than they'd wanted to believe? Journalists descended once again, poking at the wound that had never healed. Stories appeared online and on TV, dissecting the case, retracing every rumor and dead end. The gray sedan became an obsession. People scoured memories, hunting for forgotten details. A neighbor who'd sold his car, a teacher who'd moved away, a friendly face from church who'd once offered Rachel a ride. The smallest things, a stray remark, a missed phone call, a forgotten encounter, were now sifted for meaning. Evelyn found herself answering the same question, over and over. Who could it have been? Each time she tried to remember every face from Rachel's life, every friend and acquaintance, every adult who'd ever lingered a bit too long at a school event. The truth gnawed at her. Had she missed something all those years ago? Was there a sign, a warning she'd dismissed as harmless? As the weeks passed, the police uncovered one more gap in the old investigation. The original witness who'd reported seeing Rachel in the gray sedan had filed their statement with a rookie patrolman, but the report had never been entered into the case file. Lost in the shuffle, maybe misplaced on purpose, maybe just an accident born from the chaos of those frantic early days. The patrolman had since retired, living in another state. When questioned, he remembered the witness, remembered being told to keep things quiet while the department sorted out its priorities. That phrase, "keep things quiet," echoed through the new investigation. It suggested something more than simple oversight. It suggested a reluctance to dig too deep, a willingness to let uncomfortable truths slide away. The lead detective pressed harder, reviewing every case note, every offhand remark, every faded memory. In the end, the answer still lay hidden, but the cracks in Akron's silence had widened. The familiar had become unfamiliar, trust corroded by the slow drip of doubt. Rachel Monroe's story, once a closed wound, was open again, painful, unsolved, but no longer ignored. The truth was out there, waiting in the spaces between memory and forgetting, and for the first time in years, Akron was ready to face it. The momentum of the reopened investigation drew attention from beyond Akron. Reporters arrived from out of state, seeking the story behind the headlines, hoping to capture the mystery of a vanished girl and a town haunted by her memory. Rachel Monroe's name was suddenly everywhere, on news tickers, podcasts, social media threads dedicated to the missing and forgotten. For people who had never known her, Rachel became a symbol, her story a mirror for their own fears and regrets. But for Evelyn Monroe, and for those who'd carried Rachel's absence like a weight for 14 years, the new attention brought little comfort. Her daughter's fate, once a private ache, was now a public spectacle. Cameras lingered on her porch. Strangers sent letters, some offering prayers, others their own stories of loss. The faces changed, the words blurred, but the hollow in Evelyn's chest remained the same, a space no news cycle could fill. It was only as the case grew colder again, as weeks passed with no new answers, that the story shifted. Journalists began to draw parallels to another missing girl. This one lost decades earlier, from a different part of Ohio. Her name was Linda Pagano. Linda had disappeared in 1974 at the age of 17, her case all but forgotten by the world. Like Rachel, Linda's absence left a scar on her family and community. Flyers had faded, rumors curdled, and the trail of hope grew cold. In Linda's case, too, there had been a discovery. A set of bones found in a park not long after she vanished, recorded with little ceremony, the remains labeled only as unidentified female, and buried in a pauper's grave. For more than 40 years, Linda's family had mourned in limbo, her name just one more among Ohio's countless missing. What changed everything was not a detective or a reporter, but a student. just as Allison Price had found the thread of Rachel's story. Another young researcher, someone unwilling to let the past stay buried, began combing through state records, looking for patterns among unidentified remains. Online communities of amateur sleuths and genealogy enthusiasts took up the case, piecing together the timeline, comparing dental records, pushing for the kind of DNA testing that had finally brought closure to Rachel's family. The stories, though separated by time, began to echo each other. Two girls, the same age, lost to the same shadows. Two families who never stopped searching. Two communities shaped by the silence that followed their disappearances. Both had been buried not just in the earth, but in the paperwork and neglect of a system overwhelmed by loss. In 2018, Linda Pagano's identity was finally restored. Her bones, mislaid for decades, were given back to her family. Old wounds opened anew, but now there was an ending, a gravestone, a place to grieve, the bittersweet peace of finally knowing. Rachel Monroe's case, inspired by Linda's true story, now stood as a tribute, not only to one girl's life, but to all those who had slipped through the cracks. For Evelyn, reading Linda's name in the news was like looking into a parallel world. She felt kinship with Linda's family, two mothers joined by the impossible burden of not knowing, the years of unanswered questions, the strange comfort in rituals that refused to let go. She realized, too, that justice wasn't always about finding the guilty or mending what was broken. Sometimes it was about memory, refusing to let a name vanish, refusing to let a life go unmarked. Rachel's friends, now scattered adults, organized an online memorial. They shared photos from their teenage years, Rachel's sketches, her crooked smile, her boots kicked up on a park bench. Strangers joined, leaving messages for families like Rachel's and Linda's. The comments section swelled with empathy and grief, reminders that for every headline, there was a life, a ripple of connections that stretched far beyond Akron or Ohio. Some shared stories of their own lost loved ones. Others promised to pay closer attention, to never dismiss a missing person as a runaway, to fight for names and faces left in the shadows. Akron changed in small ways. The high school added a plaque for missing students, Rachel's name etched in silver beneath a spray of wildflowers. The park bench where she once sketched became a place for quiet remembrance, sometimes with candles, sometimes with fresh chalk drawings left by children who'd never known her but knew her story. Each year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, people gathered in the park and on virtual message boards, their voices joining with those across the state and the country, a chorus of memory and stubborn hope. For the police, the lesson was bitter and clear. Every missing person's case, no matter how cold, could be someone's Rachel, someone's Linda. Files were reopened, evidence reviewed, calls made to families long since resigned to silence. Some wounds healed, others reopened, but a sense of duty grew, a determination not to forget, not to let another girl slip away unnoticed. Rachel Monroe's story, though fictional, had become real in the way that all stories do when they are shared. She stood for the missing, the overlooked, the voices almost lost. And for every candle lit in her memory, there was the quiet, stubborn promise that no one should ever be forgotten. For a long time, the name Rachel Monroe lingered in Akron as something fragile, a whisper carried on autumn winds, a photograph yellowing in the window of a house that felt perpetually on the verge of memory and forgetting. But after the truth came to light, the story changed shape. It stopped being just a tale of loss and became a lesson about the deep, echoing power of remembrance. Rachel's seat at the Monroe table was never filled. Evelyn, her hair gone gray and hands thinner now, continued to set a plate for her daughter each evening. Some might have called it stubbornness or denial, but for Evelyn, it was an act of love, a way to honor the years that Rachel should have had, the birthdays missed, the holidays spent with an empty chair. The room Rachel grew up in remained untouched, sketchbooks stacked on the desk, band posters curling at the corners, a jacket still hanging on the back of the chair. Sometimes, sunlight would stream through the window and paint the room gold, catching dust motes in the air, and for a moment, the past felt impossibly close. After Rachel's remains were identified, and the truth about her death became public, the city tried to give her the tribute she deserved. There was a new plaque installed at the high school, her name inscribed with quiet dignity among others lost too soon. At the park, where Rachel used to sit and draw, a sturdy bench appeared, carved with her initials and set beneath a sycamore tree. Every spring, wildflowers bloomed at its base, some planted by her old friends, others left by strangers moved by her story. Children chalked bright drawings along the pathway. Never knowing Rachel, but still carrying a sliver of her legacy in every mark they left behind. Rachel's case changed Akron. For the police, her name became a kind of vow, an insistence that no case was ever too cold, no life too small to matter. Detective files were dusted off, new eyes brought to bear on the evidence of the forgotten. A local advocacy group grew out of the efforts to identify Rachel, dedicated to supporting families of the missing and to pressing for reform in how authorities handled such cases. Across Ohio, the echoes of Rachel's story inspired other communities to look inward, to remember those they'd lost, to refuse the comfort of forgetting. Evelyn found herself part of a quiet network of mothers and fathers, siblings and friends, all bound together by loss and a relentless hope for answers. They met sometimes in the church basement, sometimes online, sharing photographs, memories, and encouragement. For each, the pain never truly faded, but there was a kind of healing in the sharing, in the refusal to let grief turn to silence. For Rachel's friends, now scattered across the country, her memory became a guiding force. They followed their own paths, some into art, some into teaching, some into law. Each carried a piece of that restless teenage energy Rachel had embodied, the belief that the world could and should be changed, the stubborn refusal to look away from what was hard or ugly. They wrote her name into the acknowledgments of books, tattooed a small R on their wrists, told her story when people asked what had shaped them. The story of Rachel Monroe, like the true story of Linda Pagano, became a touchstone for others. Podcasts told her tale. College classes analyzed the mistakes and lessons of her investigation. For those who had never known her, Rachel was more than a cautionary tale. She was a reminder that every missing person is a world undone. A life that echoes across time and space, leaving ripples that can change hearts and policies alike. Rachel's legacy was not just in her sketches or the bench beneath the sycamore tree, but in the way she reminded a city, maybe a nation, of the need to pay attention. She taught people to look closer at the world around them, to check in on neighbors, to take seriously the stories of those who go missing. Her story whispered the simple, urgent lesson: never dismiss warning signs, never take safety for granted, and never silence your instincts when something feels wrong. As the years stretched on, Rachel's absence became less of an open wound and more of a solemn promise. Akron would not forget. Evelyn, as long as she lived, would keep the porch light burning each night, a beacon for the lost and for hope itself. And through every retelling, on anniversaries, in classrooms, in circles of friends and strangers, Rachel's story continued to do its quiet, vital work, to keep the candle of truth burning, to bring a measure of justice and healing to wounds that might otherwise never close. Some scars never truly fade. But sometimes, the act of remembering, of bearing witness, of refusing to let a name disappear, can light a way forward for others still searching in the dark. If you were moved by Rachel's story, take a moment to share her name and the names of the missing in your own community. Subscribe, stay vigilant, and help us keep these stories alive. Because the light of truth is sometimes the only thing that brings justice, healing, and hope to those still waiting for answers.